The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, baking the world in an oppressive heat. A hawk circled lazily overhead, its shadow gliding across the endless expanse of sand and scrub. This was the Mojave Desert, a harsh and unforgiving landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see. Twisted Joshua trees clawed at the sky, their spiky branches casting long, eerie shadows. This was the landscape that greeted David as he drove his beat-up Ford pickup truck deeper into the heart of the Mojave. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning the horizon for any sign of life, but he was utterly alone. David was a man running from his past, seeking solace in the solitude of the open road. The desert, with its harsh indifference, seemed like the only place vast enough to contain his pain. Days blurred into one another as he drove, the monotony broken only by the occasional gas station or roadside diner. He told himself that he would keep driving until he reached the coast, until the vastness of the Pacific Ocean washed away the remnants of his past. On the third day of his journey, David stumbled upon a small, dusty town seemingly forgotten by time. A faded sign proclaimed it to be Desert Springs, though there was little sign of life. The only business open seemed to be a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the midday heat. Hunger gnawed at David's stomach, and he decided to stop for a bite to eat. As he stepped out of the car, a wave of heat washed over him, and he felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine. She was an old woman, impossibly old, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and age spots. Her white hair was pulled back in a tight bun, revealing the sharp angles of her skull. But it was her eyes that drew David's attention. They were a piercing blue, like chips of ice, and they seemed to bore into him, seeing right through to his soul. David tried to avoid her gaze, focusing instead on the chipped Formica tabletop and the faded advertisements for long-forgotten brands. He glanced up and his heart skipped a beat. The old woman was staring at him, her piercing blue eyes unwavering. There was no malice in her gaze, but it sent a shiver down John's spine. He quickly averted his eyes, focusing on his coffee cup. But deep down, a primal instinct warned him that something wasn't right. He finished his coffee in a single gulp, paid his bill, and practically ran out of the diner. As he pulled away from the diner, he glanced back in the rearview mirror. The old woman was still sitting in the booth, her piercing blue eyes watching him go. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, baking the interior of David's pickup truck.
He had been driving for hours since leaving the diner, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the unsettling old woman.
He glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, his heart skipping a beat. There in the distance, a faint speck appeared on the horizon. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. David pressed down on the accelerator, urging his truck to go faster. He could see the driver more clearly this time. It was her, the old woman from the diner. Panic surged through him. This was insane. How could she possibly be following him? He gripped the steering wheel until his hands ached, his knuckles white with tension. He considered pulling over, confronting her, demanding to know what she wanted. Miles turned into an agonizing crawl as David tried to outrun the impossible. He scanned the horizon desperately, searching for any sign of civilization, any escape from this relentless pursuit. He thought about calling for help, but his cell phone had died hours ago. As the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert, David's hope began to dwindle. He couldn't outrun her forever. Just when his despair was threatening to consume him, he spotted a sign in the distance. He didn't hesitate. He swerved the truck off the highway, tires spitting gravel, and sped towards the motel. The motel was a sorry sight, a collection of dilapidated buildings clustered around a flickering neon sign that proclaimed it to be the Desert Rose Motel. He jumped out, his legs shaky beneath him, and ran inside. The office was empty, a bell above the door jingling mournfully in his wake. He grabbed the room key and a flickering kerosene lamp from behind the counter. His footsteps echoed on the creaking wooden floor as he walked down the shadowy corridor to his room. The room was small and musty, smelling of dust and stale cigarettes. He locked the door behind him, the sound echoing in the silence. He needed to think, to come up with a plan. He was safe here for now, at least. Hours dragged by, each tick of his wristwatch amplified in the silence. Sleep eluded him, slipping further away with every passing second. He lay on the bed, fully clothed, his senses on high alert, every muscle tensed and ready. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the window pane sent a jolt of fear through him, making his heart race. He imagined the old woman out there, in the darkness, her eyes glowing like embers, watching, waiting, her presence a constant, oppressive weight. He tried to distract himself, to focus on anything but the fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind, threatening to consume him. He paced the small room, his footsteps a steady rhythm against the silence, a desperate attempt to keep his mind occupied. He tried reading the tattered Gideon Bible he found in the bedside drawer, but the words seemed to swim before his eyes, their meaning lost in his terror, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He went to the window and peered out into the darkness, searching for any sign of life. The desert night was a vast, empty canvas, dotted with a million pinpricks of starlight, each one a distant, cold reminder of his isolation. The air was still and silent, heavy with the weight of secrets, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. He scanned the darkness, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the old woman's presence, but finding only shadows. But there was nothing, just the endless, indifferent desert, stretching out before him like a dark and terrible promise, a void that seemed to swallow all hope. He knew it was only a matter of time. She would come for him, as surely as the night follows the day. He could feel it in his bones, a deep primal certainty, an instinct that told him danger was near. He was running out of time, and he was running out of options, his mind racing to find a way out of this nightmare. He didn't wait to see what came next. The urgency in his steps was palpable, driven by an instinctual fear. He didn't care anymore about reasoning or explanations. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between him and the source of his terror. He only knew that he had to get away, to escape the chilling certainty in those glowing eyes. He had to run, to flee from the malevolent presence that seemed to pierce through the darkness. He threw open the door and ran, not caring where he was going, as long as it was away from that room, away from that motel, away from the creature that had taken the form of an old woman. The night air hit him like a wall, but he pushed through, driven by sheer panic. He didn't look back, but he could feel her presence behind him, a coldness that seeped into his bones, a darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. Every step felt like a battle against the encroaching dread. He burst out of the motel and into the desert night, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for him to stop, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. He kept running, stumbling over rocks and scrub, the rough terrain tearing at his clothes, his skin. The pain was a distant echo compared to the terror that fueled his flight. He didn't care. He had to get away. The desert stretched out before him, an endless expanse of potential salvation or doom. He ran until he couldn't run anymore, collapsing on the cold, hard sand, his chest heaving, his body racked with sobs. The night sky above offered no comfort, only a reminder of his isolation. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, staring up at the indifferent stars, the vastness of the desert sky pressing down on him like a shroud. The stars twinkled coldly, uncaring of his plight. He was lost, alone, and utterly terrified. The desert seemed to mock his desperation, its vastness a cruel reminder of his insignificance. He didn't know how long he lay there, but as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pink and orange, he finally forced himself to his feet. The light brought a sliver of hope, a promise of a new beginning. He looked back at the motel, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky. It seemed almost unreal, a distant memory of a nightmare. He half expected to see her standing there, a figure of dread silhouetted against the rising sun, but there was nothing. Just the empty motel, and the vast, indifferent desert, stretching out before him like a waking nightmare. The desert was both his enemy and his refuge, a place where he could lose himself, and perhaps find a way to start anew. The journey ahead was uncertain, but he knew he had to keep moving. I stood there for a long moment, my breath catching in my throat, my limbs heavy with exhaustion and terror. The weight of the night's events pressed down on me, making it hard to even think clearly. The rising sun cast long, eerie shadows across the desert, painting the familiar landscape in an unsettling light. It was a stark reminder that even the most beautiful dawn could hide the darkest secrets. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the dry brush. Each gust seemed to carry with it a whisper of the past, a reminder of the horrors that had unfolded. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The stillness was unnerving, as if the very ground beneath me was alive with anticipation. He had never felt so alone, so utterly vulnerable. The vastness of the desert, once a source of strange comfort, now felt oppressive, suffocating. The endless expanse seemed to mock his isolation. It was as if the very air he breathed was tainted with the memory of the night before, thick with an unseen menace. Every breath was a struggle, laden with the weight of unseen eyes watching. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving, put as much distance as possible between myself and the Desert Rose Motel, and the horror it held. The memories of that place were too vivid, too haunting. He turned and began walking, his steps slow and unsteady at first, each one a battle against the fear that threatened to paralyze him, gradually gaining purpose as he moved. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The highway shimmered in the distance, a mirage beckoning him towards, what? Safety? Sanity? Could he ever truly outrun the memory of that night? The chilling certainty that he had looked into the face of something truly evil? The questions haunted him as much as the memories did. The drive back was a blur. I drove mechanically, my mind numb, my body running on autopilot. I avoided looking in the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see. The endless ribbon of asphalt stretched before me, a physical manifestation of my own unraveling sanity. The familiar landmarks he had passed on his journey out now seemed alien, distorted through the lens of his fear. The roadside diners, once havens of greasy food and idle chatter, now appeared sinister, potential hiding places for the creature that haunted his every waking moment. I barely slept, surviving on a diet of stale gas station snacks and bitter coffee. The caffeine did little to clear the fog of fear and exhaustion that clung to me like a shroud. I saw her face everywhere I looked, in the shadows of passing cars, in the reflection of shop windows, and the faces of strangers. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, a cruel trick of my sleep-deprived mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. She was out there, somewhere, watching me, waiting for me to let down my guard, and she would be back. I had no doubt about that. I eventually made it back home, back to the life I had so desperately tried to outrun. But the desert, and the horrors I had encountered there, returned with me. They were etched into the very fabric of my being, an indelible stain on my soul. His friends and family noticed the change in him. He was withdrawn, distant, his eyes haunted by a darkness they couldn't comprehend. He tried to tell them about what he had seen, about the old woman, the motel, the terror that had gripped him in the desert night. But words failed him. How could he possibly explain the unexplainable, the sheer primal fear that had seeped into his bones? They offered platitudes, reassurances that I was safe now, that it was all in the past. But their words rang hollow. They hadn't seen what I had seen. They hadn't looked into the abyss and felt its icy breath on their skin. He tried to resume his old life, to find solace in familiar routines. But the fear lingered, a constant, unwelcome companion. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that she was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Years have passed since that fateful night in the desert. Years filled with therapy, medication, and the desperate hope that time would heal all wounds. But the memory of the Desert Rose Motel and the creature that haunted its halls remains. It's a chilling reminder that there are some things in this world that defy explanation, that some doors are best left unopened. I still drive, but I avoid the desert. I stick to the crowded freeways, the comforting anonymity of city streets. I can't bear the thought of being alone on that open road, the vast emptiness a constant reminder of my own vulnerability. I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that I will never truly escape that night. The desert and the demon it holds will follow me forever. A shadow lurking at the edge of my vision, a whisper in the back of my mind. And I will never again look at an old woman or a lonely stretch of highway without feeling a shiver of primal fear run down my spine. No one will ever understand.